wonderful to join you here because these events are indeed so important. And a shout out to Angie and the entire team for making me feel so welcome. This is really my first opportunity to meet the Polkadot ecosystem in person, and all the work around the Web3 Foundation, I believe, has a different set of goals and a mission here within the Web3 space that we really would love to understand more about. So in my talk today, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of how we see the forthcoming challenges around authenticity, specifically with artificial intelligence. And we've been at this work for about half a decade. So I'll share with you first some of the work that we've done at the lab, at the Starling lab, and then also speak to you about the path ahead and ground it into some context that often is missing from these conversations. So first, a little bit about the Starling Lab. I created the Starling Lab 5 years ago with the goal of seeing how we could use decentralized technologies to help impact human rights. And we founded this at Stanford and the USC Shoah Foundation. And really what emerged was a framework in which we were able to take very complicated technologies around cryptography and break it down for practitioners to understand how we could use these to capture, store, and verify information. Sounds simple, but in many of the places where we started, this work was actually immensely complicated because it worked at scale, and it was entrenched in fact, very complicated disciplines. So as a starting point, we began working with historians. And we took 5 petabytes worth of very vulnerable data. It's video testimonies of the survivors of genocide. And we started to figure out, well, how can we use cryptography to help encrypt, authenticate, and then distribute this information in such a way that it would be very difficult for it to be censored or to be destroyed, and that as it was distributed, also how could we preserve its authenticity? Because at the time, 5 years ago, there was this specter of deep fakes. It wasn't quite there yet, but we had a sense that this was going to be a big challenge in creating trust in our digital media. We moved on upstream from the archive directly into the cameras themselves. And we began working with the camera manufacturers and experimenting with different cryptographic techniques that, in fact, on the camera or tethered to the camera, you'd have a notary that would allow you to establish the original file and then notarize also things like this here, the authenticity of who took the photograph or when it was taken or where it was taken. And these were critical for establishing provenance, and we were helpful in establishing a conversation around just not taking anything for granted with a photograph. And that proved to be quite prescient in our work with Reuters, and later on, Adobe and the New York Times and others, and helping create what became the C2PA standard, which injects these types of identifiers directly into the photograph. And then also our role was creating bridges into Web3. How could you use a variety of different cryptographic tools to help authenticate and distribute and preserve, et cetera, these types of photographs? And we put that actually directly into the file itself. And now there are cameras, all these years later, that are shipping with this type of standard actually natively on board. So it's been an incredible journey there. And it started with a prototype that we were doing with Reuters, in which we took photographs from every day from the election until the inauguration in 2020, and that included January 6th, where now we have an authenticated Web3 archive of that day in what has now emerged as a very disputed piece of history. We moved on to work with lawyers and prosecutors and the judiciary to understand how you could use authentication technology to help seal evidence and create a chain of custody in very difficult information circumstances, like, for instance, Northwest Syria, where we began, which is really, you can think of as the training ground for a lot of the mis and disinformation that we're seeing now. There had been happening for years, and we were trying to create an archive that would be able to withstand the challenges of the mis and disinformation, and for the long haul, prove that there were standards that could be used for some form of accountability. And that sadly prepared us for the work that we did in Ukraine. Again, authenticating information that was coming from the field. And there, we really kind of settled on this idea of explaining to people that what you have with very dense and complicated cryptographic technologies is actually something very simple. It's like this, a digital evidence bag, in which you could take something as vulnerable as a Telegram post, put it into the bag, metaphorically, seal it, provide the critical metadata, the chain of custody, and the ability to audit it. All those things coming together, now you could start to talk to lawyers and prove to them, yeah, in fact, this stuff isn't just crazy technology that's from a community that you can't understand. We're grounding it in very clear analogies, and then we sprung into action. We wrote with my colleague here, Basil, a 100-page legal analysis around evidence that we collected in Kharkiv in Ukraine and submitted to the ICC the first Article 15 recommendation that was backed by a cryptographic dossier to help document alleged war crimes on schools in Kharkiv. So, putting the standards into action. Finally, I'll go over this small case study that really put together all the different things that we did. We worked with Rolling Stone for the better part of a year and launched an investigation into this photograph here. It was taken at the start of the war in the Balkans, and there was an investigative journalism piece that essentially uncovered who the individual was in that photograph. And every piece of information in that magazine article was accompanied with this, an authentication certificate, in which we were able to take photographs and then other forms of documentation that was used to establish who this individual was and put it on chain. Why? Is because we started to use the framework to establish how this information was captured, how it was stored, how it was verified. And this proved to be critical because it wasn't just one photograph. You see, in order to do the journalism properly, we created an archive, and that archive had a variety of different documents. So it had things like this, a payroll record, in which we're able to establish the group of individuals around the subject, how they were paid, what their membership was in different paramilitary activities. And using cryptography, we not only established the authenticity of this payroll record and its provenance, but also you can see here the redactions. We used some of the early zero-knowledge proofs that nearly melted our GPUs. But what they did is they proved that the only change to this document was that black rectangle. And so now we had a proper establishment not only of the original document, but also the redaction. And this grew into a web of different activity that now, with cryptography, not only were you able to give confidence to the investigators as they were proceeding with this project, but then also for the lawyers that needed to publish this information, it gave them increasing confidence that we could protect the privacy of the individuals who were not subjects of this journalism project, but instead, it allowed us to focus on the individuals of interest, and by identifying them through the payroll records, we then moved on to see that, well, many of them are free. They're operating with impunity. They're living on the streets of Belgrade and elsewhere, and they're very open about their relationships. And in fact, we're able to work with a variety of individuals to identify, well, that there's a web of activity here online. Literally, they're friends on Instagram and Facebook. And we preserved all of that and presented this web of evidence that allowed us to trace information from their activities from the beginning of the war in the Balkans, even up to the present day support for paramilitary activity in Ukraine. In other words, the impunity, the cycle of violence, yet continues. So that's the power of these type of authentication certificates. They're able to back up ephemeral content with the most advanced cryptography, and using decentralized technology, we're able to ensure that you have proper consensus around the hardening of this type of evidence and also a mechanism for preservation. And that can hopefully bring justice to the victims who to this day have not been able to have a proper day in court. With this investigation, we were proudly able to restart that conversation with prosecutors, and hopefully that will lead to some accountability. But this time, the digital evidence that accompanies all of that, well, there's more to it. There's hardening, and there's an understanding of the veracity of this in an age of mis and disinformation. So here's the interesting thing. This article was released mid-December, and 15 days before the article was released, ChatGPT went live. And this is that moment in which you have AI going mainstream. And it dawned on us that now, 5 years after all this hard work, well, now the critical moment had arrived in which, in fact, AI was going to be challenging the very conventions of digital authenticity. So Here's the interesting thing as well. 15 days before ChatGPT goes live, FTX collapses. And so you could take these series of events and say, well, that's basically the end of this era for cryptography, right? We had our moment, we blew it. Well, that, of course, is a very limited definition of crypto. That would mean that, like, basically the entire activity was premised on this notion of payments. And I think there's a very good debate to even say that FTX was probably the worst implementation of a decentralized technology, because it wasn't really decentralized at all. But I'd argue that that's actually missing the whole point. The stack for Web3 is much richer and deeper, and that's in fact what we're talking about here. It can begin with things like storage, it can move on to content addressing and identity and governance. Limiting this discussion around authenticity and trust to just merely payments, you're basically cutting off the entire debate about what we want for the future of the web. These types of crypto utilities should not be taken for granted, and we've been using them to help historians and lawyers and journalists protect their very vulnerable records. And now with AI, you could say that this is some sort of new frontier and that we have to bring the crypto community to AI. You hear that a lot, right? The pairing of those two. And I think that that framing is fundamentally incorrect, because AI, in a sense, is inference on the collection of human knowledge, on things like the Common Crawl. And what is that? It's the web. So every single person here that's thinking about Web3, you're already in the debate, whether you like it or not, around AI. And the way that I've understood this is to look just a little bit broader in history. So I'll try to end my talk with just this scape, because I think it's really important to understand that the beginnings of this era really weren't founded in the 1990s, as people like to say about payments and cryptography used for that mechanism. It actually goes all the way back to a prior era where we had open source software, open source computing, to the 1950s, in which there had to be this dream in which people said, hey, can we take something like this, which at the time was a state-of-the-art, that was a personal computer. And mind you, the computer is not the thing he's interfacing with, it's just to the left of him, it's that refrigerator. And we had to say this: could this be the basis of a new type of network of knowledge and trust? And at Stanford, what was really interesting about this is that, in fact, that question around the augmentation of human knowledge was put into direct competition with the artificial intelligence lab. So you have the augment intelligence folks and you have the artificial intelligence teams. They did not see eye to eye on what the possibilities of this technology were. One worked to replace humans, the others were seeking to improve the human condition. And in these geopolitical times back in the 1950s, this was very much an ideological project around what is the essence of Western civilization and how it's going to be able to use these types of technologies. That's how the initial checks were written. Let's be very clear. Sounds familiar, right, to today's age in which we're talking about geopolitics and technology? But if you go back to the Augmented Intelligence Framework, which was written in the 1950s, I think you'll see something astonishing. That the framework posited that you could have a personal computer and you could have a decentralized network of knowledge. That's the origin story of today's entire information landscape. Think about that. Set forward very clearly in the 1950s, and they progressed to now start to productize those into things like this, like a screen. Oh, sorry, a little latency. There it is. A screen, a mouse. That's how we started to have an interface not only into this type of network, but also this promise about how we wanted to create the web. And folks like Doug Engelbart, who are really forgotten in the grand scheme of history for really architecting, he's credited with inventing the mouse. It's just such a small fraction of actually what he contributed as an overall architecture of knowledge. And what we know of as the web today, which follows things like the end-to-end principle, well, it's encoded with these really critical ideas about how you would create a network of knowledge, that it would be interoperable, that it'd be neutral, and that you'd place the intelligence at the edges of the network with the user. And I like to think of that as a software code, maybe even a moral code, or an internet code. And when you look at the very first web server from Tim Berners-Lee, and literally had to put a sticker on it telling people, hey, this is a server. That sticker is important because what it is essentially a reminder of is that this first node on the web was a personal computer, not a mainframe computer. And that's no accident, because there was a vision that was articulated very early on about how we wanted to have a culture around the creation of this technology and the creation of this network. And folks like Stuart Brand, I presented a very idealistic picture of this, but I think it animates many of the aspirations of people in this room, which is this idea that you have a notion of self-reliance and also generosity that follows with it, which I think often gets lost in these discussions around tokenomics, that actually we're in this together to create something much more resilient than just greed. And the alternative, of course, is a centralized network, one that, at the time, when all of this was conceived, was operated by the world's largest monopoly. There were 1 million people working for AT&T. And so they had to posit, wait, could we create a new set of technologies that could do far better? So, is this the future that we want for AI? A centralized platform in which we have only a very small set of companies that control access to the world's knowledge? Or can we reimagine things? Because we know that the problems are very, very real, and we also know that they can be solved with technology that's being developed right here. So for example, AI infrastructure. We already know that it has been highly manipulated in the supply chain. Well, in the Web3 community, we've already thought about massive infrastructure that is decentralized and that can scale. Open source AI requires not just the availability of the code, because we know that actually there's a lot more at stake. It's not just about open sourcing information, but it's governing it. Because take a look at something like this. This is stability. It's an open source AI algorithm. And if you want to say that, well, all that needs to happen is open source technology is just going to ride off into a happy future, see what happens when you put into prompts and stability something like this, a color photograph of an engineer or a teacher, a housekeeper, a drug dealer, a terrorist. This is the current state of AI. Obviously, it has deficits, even open source AI. AI access. Well, we know that there's going to be huge problems in which if we can get through even the questions about fair use and copyright, what is the information that's going to be put into these algorithms when you have active efforts to destroy the world's knowledge that is inconvenient, or in this case, even just gross negligence, right? Based on, I don't even know where to begin with this. And then there's AI literacy. These are challenges in which we need to think about how we're going to interface with these new technologies because, in fact, just like we did with the transition of the web, now there's another transition in which we need to renegotiate our relationship with how we're teaching our children how to interface with these types of networks, because they're already creating massive amounts of fraud. And they're affecting our legal systems already in due course. And they're affecting our fact checkers already, making their life, which is quite difficult to begin with, nearly impossible now to deal with. And finally, of course, there's this question around how we're going to be delivering our news in an era in which, well, you have news that's going to be delivered maybe even by AI anchors. So that's the negative side of things. And I'll talk even about some opportunities around AI. For instance, this month there was a major judgment against Google for its monopolization on search. That's a major opportunity for us to step in and start to use new decentralized technologies to figure out alternatives, specifically how they could affect AI discovery. And then finally, this question around AI expression. And I want to really just leave you with this vivid image, because we focused on the authenticity of images. Well, look at something like this. This is the future of AI, a couple steps ahead. This is what's called spatial intelligence, in which we take just 3 photographs. That's what's there on the left-hand side. And on the right, you're able to use AI to now step into this immersive environment. Just 3 photographs, and now you have a whole scene that you can walk through. I look at this, and I'm not scared by this. I just simply am asking important questions around how we can deal with authenticity and new forms of expression. So let's add all of these problems and these opportunities that I enumerated. And what I believe is that Web3 is already a stakeholder in many of these solutions. So the notion of how we have to bring AI into Web3, it's just fundamentally backwards. It's AI is the fullest expression of the internet, and it's up to us as stewards of the internet to make good on this opportunity and to think about new incentives, new ways of collaborating, new forms of resilience. And these are questions that in our community we've actually already addressed in the hardest way, which is that we've made them decentralized. And the primitives that we're bringing into this are immensely powerful. They can create new forms of trust, the ability to identify the provenance of content, the permanence, and finally, the ability to make sure that things are not tamper-proofed. These are all the critical questions people are saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do in this age of AI? We've already been at this successfully. So this notion of decentralized AI is really a question around the decentralized web. It's really a question around interoperability, which is, I think, something that's a key principle within the group of people identified here. And the internet, let's remember, of course, is really grounded in all the principles I discussed. But even just the etymology, I think, gives us a very clear roadmap. What is the internet? It's a network of networks, right? The interconnection between these networks. And so I'll conclude by saying, in identifying these problems and opportunities, we at the lab here are really excited to start to work with folks in this ecosystem. In particular, we have a new node that we're launching, which has 20 petabytes worth of storage. It's going to be available in a couple of weeks. And we want to use this to help the journalists and the historians and lawyers that we're working with and think of the opportunity of what we can actually store on something like this. It's got a massive, massive scale. So what we need is we want to build layers of authenticity around this to accomplish all the things that I've described as basically the opportunities around how Web3 can actually solve the critical problems that AI is presenting to us and seize this opportunity to restore trust in our amazing network of knowledge with the web. So thank you so much for having me here, and we look forward to discussing more of these opportunities together in the next few days. Find myself or Basil, and let's talk. Thanks.